The hi-fi era began in the period immediately after World War II, when several returning GIs craved better, reproduced music in their homes. Manufacturers got into the act by producing high-quality speaker systems and amplifiers. Hi-fi shops sprung up across the nation. Several systems were built into wall units or bookshelves, along with a variety of other components. Hi-fi shops offered methods to compare different speaker systems and amplifiers. Interior designers came up with unique ways to display the equipment or hide it when necessary. Speaker systems were available in a wide variety of designs and cabinet enclosures, all with a home audio enthusiast in mind. Among the first of the component hi-fi systems introduced after World War II is the Altec 101 tuner and power amplifier. This system was meant to be built in either to a bookshelf or a specialized wall unit. The amplifier uses a pair of 6L6s and puts out about 15 watts. The tuner preamp has dual eye tubes for tuning. Later, in the mid-50s, Altec introduced the 340 amplifier and 440C preamp. This amplifier was among the first to use the 6550 beam pentode tubes in 1955. It also used a pair of Peerless transformers and a voltage regulator tube for the screen grids. The matching preamp was the 440C, a full-featured mono unit with a master volume control and variable bass and treble using 3 dual triode tubes. Bogen's triode amplifier of the early 50s was the HO10, using a full triode circuitry and a pair of 6 B4 filamentary triodes, putting out about 10 watts. Brook Electronics introduced the 12A3 amp and preamp in about 1948, and it was considered high-end in its day. The amplifier is a full triode unit with 2 2A3 filamentary triodes, 2 6J5s, and a 6SN7 in the front end, all mounted on an aluminum chassis. The preamp is one of very unusual construction features with stepped volume and tone controls, and the tubes mounted upside down, accessible just by turning over the chassis. Radio Craftsman was a very popular name in hi-fi during the 1950s. This amplifier, the C550, used a pair of KT66s to develop about 30 watts through the ultralinear type transformer. 6 SN7s were used for the phase inverter and driver stage. The C550 used a relay delay tube to slow warm-up time, thus preserving the cathodes on the KT66 output tubes. All the transformers and tubes were mounted on a beautifully chrome-plated steel chassis with a nicely engraved nameplate. The matching preamp for this amplifier is the Craftsman C900. This tuner is an FM-only unit and is meant to be built in to a cabinet or a wall unit. The dial has gold-plated lettering with a pillowed background. Dynaco started in 1955 with the Mark II power amplifier. This amplifier put out 50 watts using a pair of EL34s driven by a 6AN8 tube. This amplifier had the potted version of the A431 output transformer. ICO was a popular kit manufacturer in the 1950s and 60s. The ICO HF60 was the largest of their monoblock amplifiers. It produced 60 watts, all this from a pair of EL34 output tubes driven by an EF86 first audio stage and a 6SN7 phase inverter. The rectifier tube is the 5AR4 slow warm-up version. The output transformer is the famous Acrosound TO330, which had an extremely wide bandwidth. Fisher was a very popular name in the early days of hi-fi. The 50AZ was their first attempt at producing separate component systems. This amplifier, introduced in the 1950s, produced 40 watts from a pair of 1614 industrial tubes connected in triode. The amplifier also had a regulated power supply. Fisher's 70RT and 70AZ came out in about 1955. They were meant to be built into a cabinet. The power amplifier produces 30 watts using a pair of 5081 output tubes. The tuner preamp is full-featured for both AM and FM and has a tuning eye tube to indicate signal strength. Fisher's 80AZ and 90C preamp were introduced in the mid to late 50s. The amplifier puts out about 30 watts. The preamplifier is a full-featured mono unit with variable input controls, a presence control, and jeweled lights for indicating which function was on. The preamp also features a potted power transformer to reduce noise levels. The British were quite busy in the post-war period, and Goodsell manufactured this 10-watt triode amplifier with matching preamp in about 1950. The amplifier is of massive construction using KT66s and a Partridge output transformer with beautiful wiring techniques. The preamp had a bakelite front panel and stepped controls. Again, the construction was beautiful, as is apparent with this picture inside of the unit. Wiring techniques are typically British, being tied off and of wonderful construction. Heathkit was an extremely popular kit manufacturer in the 1950s. The Heath WM2 is a 20-watt Williamson type amplifier with two chassis, one for the power supply and one for the power stage. Later, they introduced the Heath WM4 with the matching preamp. They put everything on one chassis but still had the same tube complement using 5881s, 6SN7s, and a 5V4 rectifier. The preamp was full-featured and meant to be plugged into the power amplifier. Following this was the Heath WM5, a beautiful unit on a gold enamel chassis using KT66 output tubes connected to a Peerless output transformer. This amplifier produced about 25 watts. Another post-war British manufacturer was Leek. The TL12 amp and preamp were introduced in 1948, and they produced about 12 watts with a pair of KT66s. The output and other transformers are of the open frame construction. Wiring is neat and typically British in fashion. One of Macintosh's first power amplifiers was the 50W2 with matching preamp. This amplifier produced 50 watts and had two separate chassis, one for the power supply and one for the power amplifier. The output tubes are 6L6. Following the 50W2 is the A116, putting out 30 watts using 6 BG6 horizontal output tubes normally used for television sets. Note that this Macintosh doesn't have any chrome on it. In 1955, Macintosh decided to chrome their amplifiers, thus introducing the MC30, a beautiful unit with a full chrome-plated chassis and beautifully potted power transformer and output transformers. Following that was the MC60, a 60-watt mono amplifier using a pair of 6550 output tubes, a pair of 5U4s, and the standard Macintosh unity coupled circuitry. Paterson was a manufacturer located in Lafayette, California. They produced a wide variety of hi-fi equipment, and this professional series amplifier was one of them. The amp produced about 20 watts using a pair of 5881 output tubes. The preamplifier is a full-featured unit with stepped volume, tone, and equalization controls for both low level and high level. The preamp was meant to be built in to a wall unit. Pilot was a popular radio manufacturer, and they got into hi-fi in the 1950s. The 901 power amplifier put out about 10 watts with triode connected KT66s. This unit had the 5692 military version of the 6SN7s in the front end. The preamp was powered from the power amplifier. Panatron was a custom hi-fi manufacturer in the late 40s. This all-chrome unit was found in a hotel in Northern California. It was probably built in the late 40s, judging from construction techniques. Everything is chrome on this thing, and it uses a pair of 2A3 triodes for the power amp stage. It even has an eye tube to indicate signal strength. Somebody spent a lot of time and money building this combination. Reco-Cut was a big manufacturer of turntables in the late 50s. The Reco-Cut CVS came out in 1956 and had continuously variable speed from 33 to 78 RPM. This turntable was also equipped with the standard Reco-Cut arm on a nicely finished wood base. H.H. Scott was a popular manufacturer of hi-fi equipment in the post-war era. They produced a wide variety of equipment, including the binaural noise system. The 210B amplifier was introduced in 1950 and put out about 20 watts. Output tubes were the metal 6L6s. The transformers had H.H. Scott's initials cast into them. This amplifier was fully featured with bass and treble roll-off, variable loudness, variable binaural, and frequency filter switch. The amplifier had a brass nameplate attached to the top of the chassis, which was gold anodized aluminum and is a quite attractive display. Scott's first tuner was the 310A, introduced in 1954. This was of the wideband variety and featured a signal strength meter. This tuner also had very unusual construction in that the tuning indicator came out from the bottom of the chassis. Also, all of the tubes were mounted upside down underneath the chassis. Scott introduced the 330 AM/FM tuner in about 1955. It had AM on one separate dial, a tuning meter, and FM on the other dial. This tuner was mono only. A later version of Scott's power amps is the 250, which came out in late 1957. The amplifier is mounted on a gold anodized chassis and uses a pair of EL34s and two 12AU7s. It puts out about 40 watts and uses a very high quality output transformer. The nameplate is cast brass mounted on a very stylish cage. Scott even had a turntable, the famous 710 stroboscopic turntable. Mounted on stainless steel base, the turntable was a variable speed unit and this particular one had the Fairchild arm and cartridge, which were top of the line. Construction is very sturdy with cast and machine parts built to last a very long time. Stevens was a popular loudspeaker manufacturer located in Los Angeles. The 106 was one of their first coaxial speakers. It features a miniature multi-cell horn mounted right in the middle of the speaker, along with a rolled paper edge